Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jenn, and I'm here with a guest for the second time, a return visit, an author whose first book I loved and whose second book I am so excited to discuss. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes. Well, thanks so much for having me back. This is Josh Weiss, author of Beat the Devils, and my second book, Sunset Empire, which will be available wherever fine books are sold once you're listening to this podcast. And yeah, it is a sequel to my debut novel from last year, and it continues the adventures of Detective Morris Baker, a Holocaust survivor solving cases in Los Angeles in the late 50s.
This is not only like a great book in and of itself, but it is such a great second book in a series, and it like expands Morris's story in such interesting ways and introduces like a whole new cast of characters. But before we get into the book specifically too much, I like to start with a broad question. And
Sure.
I noticed on your website, you mentioned that you are really interested in the convergence of pop culture and Judaism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how that has influenced your writing, how you came to these stories and crafted these characters and this alternate history. And yeah, like, you tell me about how your interests intersect with your writing.
For sure. I mean, yeah, growing up as an Orthodox Jewish kid, I mean, I was always surrounded by these 5,000-year-old traditions that Jews have been doing forever. So as I started to uh, age and grow up and start to kind of find my passion in writing, I realized that I was most interested in finding how the general culture intersects with where I've come from and what I learned growing up, what I did, all these practices and traditions, and some of which are very strange to the outside observer. So we're just Jews are such a small part of the population that it really just kind of tickles me every time I see our culture and heritage represented on screen or in literature and comics, whatever it is, in any type of media. So I always just kind of want to boost that signal when I can. And growing up as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, hearing stories of how my grandfather went through the war and went through three different concentration camps, Auschwitz being one of them, and a death march, just these awful stories that I never got to hear from him. I mean, we were never very close. I heard it from my father, his son. Um, so I knew I always wanted to kind of tell his story in a way. I didn't really have all the facts, so I couldn't really do like a biography or anything like that. But hearing these stories, you kind of start to build this character in your head, and that was the genesis of the Morris Baker character. Really, it's based on my grandfather, loosely, but some of the biggest aspects, like his epilepsy. My grandfather had epilepsy when he was attacked by an SS guard when he was late for roll call one morning, and just kind of I've said this in other interviews. It just kind of this book was kind of just a way for me to kind of understand my grandfather a little bit more through my own eyes, just kind of exploring this character that I built in my head, and why would somebody, who went through something unspeakable like that, something we can't even fathom, how would they come out, psychologically whole? And the answer is they wouldn't. They'd be broken. They'd be angry. They'd be, they wouldn't have their faith anymore. It just they would be a broken person, and you can't really blame them in a way for kind of losing their faith, not only in religion, but in humanity after that. So that was sort of the genesis for the character. And then just setting it in the Cold War. I mean, I've just kind of always been kind of fascinated just by that time period, the Red Scare, just how we as humans, we just always need a scapegoat. We always are just, how people can, swirl up fear out of nothing, really. And during this period, people, the government's looking at Hollywood for communists. Like, who cared? Like the fact that like the government actually cared about this is just mind-boggling. And the fact that just imagining this world where Joseph McCarthy was president, and the Red Scare never ended. I just thought that would be a really great backdrop for Morris Baker, coming to America, hoping to start a new life in the land of opportunity, but realizing that the system that he just came out of is now taking root in America, was just really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is an utterly fascinating and to be clear, horrifying world that you've crafted here. And it presents so many interesting storytelling opportunities. And, while you were talking, I was thinking back when I was in grad school, I TA'd for a class called The Shaping of Modern Judaism. And it basically studied the religion from like the Black Death in Europe till the present day. And when we got to the 20th century and film culture and stuff like that, we studied A Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck and a couple other films around that time that were like sort of, making the first attempts to sort of address, anti-Semitism in America in very tentative ways, and it's not perfect, but it is like a first step. And when you
Right.
contrast this to the world that you've created in your book, like if history had just gone one way instead of the way it went, that's very sobering.
Right. And it's interesting that you bring up a gentleman's agreement because that is mentioned in this book. You know, the Jewish operators, I would say the Jewish, professionals, I guess is the better word. Directors, filmmakers, writers, whatever, what have you. They have been blacklisted. The government has turned the film industry into a federally regulated one studio kind of system. So in this book, we learned that everyone who was blacklisted, they've moved into the adult film industry and have started to make respectable films out of pornography, which I just thought was hilarious and too good to ignore, or too good not to ignore. Excuse me. So yes, we meet Daryl Zanuck, the co-founder of 20th Century Fox, and he talks to Baker about how he made Gentleman's Agreement after the war. And this is true that the Jewish kind of studio heads at the time did not want to make it because they thought it would stir up more anti-Semitism, and he kind of championed that. So I thought that was interesting. Even after we knew what the Nazis had done and after the Holocaust, American Jews were still kind of hesitant to get too Jewish in their industry. So yeah, I just thought that was, and Daryl Zanuck was not, and it was shocking to me. I thought he was Jewish with that last name, but he was not. He was Christian. But when he first came to, work in the movies, people thought he was Jewish, and he was blackballed from a country club, which did not accept his membership because they thought he was Jewish. So, um, so it just I'm kind of rambling here, but it stands to reason that the government came in and kicked out all the Jews, and they saw his last name and just assumed he was Jewish, even though he wasn't. And he kind of, as he says in the book, I could have gone back, but I prefer to kind of run my own show here.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that whole section is great. It is such a uh like really funny scene, but also very sad too, and like that's something that this book does so well is that it balances its very, somber and serious content with a lot of levity. Like there are moments where you laugh at sort of like just the like the ridiculousness of the world, Is that hard to
Mhm.
do, like to navigate that sort of that balance?
I personally, I just have a very dark sense of humor. My wife is always getting on my case because I have to make a joke out of everything. I don't know if that's some deep-seated psychological coping mechanism. It must be because everything has to be a joke with me, and just it's just the way as Jews, in the first book, Baker's partner Connolly says, what do you know about comedy? And Baker says, I'm pretty sure my people invented it. So just as Jews have been through so much hardships over the centuries, we kind of just have developed this coping skill of just making light of things. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it's just the way I write. I like to kind of inject that lightheartedness a little bit, just to kind of offset, so it doesn't ever gets too serious. I mean, obviously, you don't want to make it too flippant, and that was some of the criticism I saw around my first book. So I kind of tried to, taking that feedback that I saw, saying the first book was too lighthearted, and kind of dialing it back a little bit. But it's always in my writing. It's just kind of an instinct, just yeah, to make jokes.
I also live that way, but I also really appreciate it as like sort of character development for Morris as well, because people do tend to talk about humor as a defense mechanism, and like yes, guilty 100%, like I acknowledge that, but also I feel like like it can also be like resistance, like it can also be survival. It can also be like refusing to succumb to, the forces that are weighing you down. And there's something really like transcendent in that too. So I do appreciate it.
Right. And in this book, we kind of do learn about, he is sort of this archetypal, he's working as a private investigator in this one, and he's kind of that archetypal Humphrey Bogart, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe kind of individual. And we kind of learn, I mean, I'm not going to give anything away, but we kind of learn that this is, yeah, it is sort of like this kind of tough guy, old Hollywood kind of persona that he projects as sort of a front for who he really is. But I won't say any more than that.
Wow. Yeah, so this is so much fun. And something that I was really impressed with up front is I want to say how prescient it is. Like, and I know that that's something that we discussed with the first book, that it was very much like on the pulse of like 2020 and all of like the changes that had happened in the few years preceding that. And this one felt just as urgent, like a few years later. And I was wondering, like, especially the conspiracy theories. Like there's a lot of conspiracy theorists in you know
Right.
and that just feels like, yeah, that's something that we live with now, and I'm wondering, like, you know was there anything that for you changed in between when you were writing book 1 and 2 that sort of like influenced the world, if that makes sense?
For sure. I mean, I think this was written during COVID, so I there was no way I couldn't, talk allude to what was going on in the real world. And we have this opening scene where this Korean American man blows himself up in a department store in a suicide bombing, and it just creates this intense backlash of anti-Asian, anti-Korean sentiment in the United States. And in the first chapter, Baker is meeting with this woman, and she's, he coughs, and she thinks, he has the Yang flu or whatever the government is saying that this young man brought to the United States. Um, so it just kind of felt like, there was just no way I couldn't kind of touch on these real world events, and the conspiracy theories as well, QAnon and all that. It just felt, the first book was not meant to be an allegory for where we are as a society, but after the last few years, it just felt like I couldn't not lean into what we've been going through as a country and as a world. But it's also, just the timelessness of how, again, just scapegoating and blind hatred. We just continue to cycle through these. We have not learned from anything. We have not learned from the past. We just continue to, squabble and hate each other. So it's really, it is. I'm glad you feel it's timely, but it's also just about how we as humans, we just are doomed to repeat ourselves over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. um yeah, there's something very interesting, you know like what alternate history allows you to do, like it almost functions like sci-fi or speculative fiction in some ways. It's like you can tell the truth about like the world we live in more easily through sometimes through like a made up world, and what I love about this book is that like the first one really gave you an idea of like the atmosphere of what it would be like to live like in this McCarthy government. The second one goes into like the mechanisms of it, and like I think that's where like the conspiracy theories come in and all the other way like systems and people and groups that like maintain that oppressive atmosphere, um I don't want to get too much into who like the guest stars are because that's always such a wonderful surprise with these books. But can you talk a little bit about like some of the worlds and the rather like some of the new facets of this world that you explore in this volume?
For sure, yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, I mean, I always kind of imagined the first book as a standalone, but the more I began to think about this, and my agent and publisher were kind of like, yeah, what else could you give us from this world? So I thought, you just start to kind of think about, okay, what facets haven't we seen? And that ties back into what we were saying about, in the first book, we go to the film studio run by the government, but we don't see really what happened to everybody that kicked out. So we get to see what happens there. And this will run after the Hollywood Reporter is running an exclusive, but on this film set, we see that a young Steven Spielberg has faked his way onto this porn set, um, which again just was just I love that idea. And that where it doesn't matter what the multiverse, it doesn't matter what the universe throws at this kid. He's always going to be a filmmaker, no matter what. It doesn't matter the circumstances. Um, so yeah, it's just it was just about, in the first book we hear about internment camps, potentially they're being reopened. And in this book they are reopened, and we learn a little bit more about that and how this kind of suicide bombing has really kind of worsened the situation, the climate in the United States. So um, it was really just about kind of digging deeper, kind of paying off those things that were set up in the first book, or things that were like briefly mentioned, digging into them. I'm trying to think specifically, um, what I without giving anything away. I mean, those are just two examples, but it was really just again, just yeah, again, I guess payoff, set up and payoff is the answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I'd like to talk a little bit about like genre and like noir, and how you use it here because this is like not new to noir. Like, but noir has always kind of been about, I think, like, the gumshoe is like a really good character for investigating like the marginalized people of a particular society, because like people tend to come to them when they are desperate, when they don't have a lot of resources, when they're like are overwhelmed by their circumstances, and if they were not marginalized they would go somewhere else. And
Right.
that's something that absolutely comes up here. So I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about you know how this book starts, because you have a very classic noir scene with like a woman walking into a gumshoe's office, and I was going to say historical figures, but they're not historical. They're, they're still, some of them are still alive. Um,
Right.
can you talk a little bit about that scene and sort of like how it came to you? Because it's just such a great opener.
Yeah, I mean, like you hit the nail on the head. That is like the quintessential, mysterious woman walks into a private detective's office and asks him to find someone, and he ends up stumbling into some grand conspiracy that takes him on this crazy adventure. And that was really kind of, I mean, the more I was writing this book, the more I realized how this is really the book I wanted to write, from the get go. In Beat the Devil's, Baker is working for the LAPD, but in this one, he's a private detective. Has a little bit more freedom to kind of operate. He doesn't have anyone overseeing. There's no oversight, in a way. So I just thought it would be interesting to kind of give that classic noir opening. I just love that. It's just, if it was made into a film, it would look so cool, with the shadows and everything. So, the Venetian blinds being mentioned, like it's all very tropey stuff, but I just couldn't resist because I think it kind of really roots the reader in this almost, I try to write as cinematically as possible so the reader can picture it in their head. So it is a little bit tropey and a little me kind of, geeking out over the genre, but at the same time, it's, we have Henry Kissinger's wife asking Baker to find him. He's in Los Angeles for a, a talking tour between the U.S. and Japan. The Japanese prime minister is in town to give talks about, closer ties with the Americans. And it just kind of, again, kind of exposing like, yeah, like the government hates Chinese people and Korean people, but Japanese people, since they're having this tour, that's fine. Like, and there just is this crazy, like, okay, we have to measure, we have to use a protractor to measure your eyes to make sure you're like the right kind of Asian, like just like that insanity. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic noir setup, that first chapter, but it also kind of starts to dig into the world a little bit more and set up kind of just how topsy-turvy everything is.
Yeah, like what occurred to me while I was reading it is that it's like a very like using that as the first scene is like a really clever solution to something I always think about, like when I'm reading second books or third books in the series, which is like when you're starting the book, you have to also like set up this book, but you're also reminding the reader a little bit of like what happened last time and like where everybody is and what the world is and stuff like that. And so balancing like the old information with the new information, like it can be really challenging. And I think that the type of scene that you pick to do that with like is very elegant.
Like, yeah, that's a great point. It just kind of, if you haven't read the first book, you could definitely kind of catch up in these first few chapters, and just, kind of have a crash course on what you need to know before diving into this new mystery. So yeah, that's a great point.
And I love that, like, this one really feels in a lot of ways like the pilot, like, because now he is established like as a PA, a private eye, and um you meet like some characters that are going to be important, and like, like it's almost like in comics terms, like the first book feels like issue 0 and like this book feels like
Right, right.
issue 1. And yeah, I'm really excited to see where these characters go. Do you have more planned?
It's a great question. I do have an idea for a third one. I recently just had a brainwave about how to really tie it into one facet of the first book that I think would be really interesting. I've pitched that and a few other ideas to my agent for what we could possibly do next. So the ball is in his court. Scott, if you're listening, let's get the ball rolling. But yeah, I have a whole Google Doc of 50 pages worth of ideas. So if I'd love to do another Morris Baker, or I'd love to do something else and then come back. So it's really, we'll see what the fates have planned.
Nice. Well, it was great to have you back again. And as always, you are welcome back anytime that you have a new project. I will always, like I volunteer to be one of your first readers all the time, and it's always a
I
great chat.
appreciate that.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me back, and thank you for the kind words about the book. This was great.
Thanks. All right, listeners, please pick up Sunset Empire. When you hear this, it will be available at your favorite bookstore or library. So please pick it up. It really is a great ride.
Also, at the paper, if you missed Beat the Devil the first time around, the paperback edition is now on sale as well. So
thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure, and it's time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.